Hey guys, good morning. We are continuing in our series sort of on unity, especially unity driven out of a passage in Ephesians chapter 4. This is part 3 of our series. We started with Ephesians 4 just on week 1, really taking a look at like what it looks like to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called, and to walk as I'm sort of a representation or ambassador of Christ, and how that drives people towards Christ, which ultimately drives people to unity. And yet last week we talked a little bit about what it looks like to walk in humility and gentleness, really looking at Philippians 2 for Christ as our example of humility, and how his humility, the way he sort of approached us in our rebellion and in all the things we did against him, and his response was love, how that really serves as a model and example for us and the world. And when we do those things, it drives people to unity, not into divisiveness. This week, we're going to continue in Ephesians 4:1. I'm going to read this section to you, but we're going to talk a little bit about patience and sort of bearing and enduring with one another in love. So let me read the passage to you one more time that we've been talking about. It says, "I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord," this is Ephesians 4:1, "urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness," and this is what we're going to talk about today, "with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." And so one of the things, and I'm just going to go ahead and put the disclaimer on the front end. This is a broad brushstroke of what this is really getting at. Really, we could do 6 weeks on what it means to bear with one another with patience and bear with one another in love. That word, I mean, if you read that, it says to basically walk in a manner like walk with patience and then bear with one another in love. Those are complementary thoughts. So patience is to be able, ultimately to be able to endure, or to sort of be patient. I guess I just defined patient with patience, sort of to endure something to its end, right? Or to a reconciled point. To bear with one another in love, that word bear right there, B-E-A-R, is used throughout the New and Old Testament. It's really in the New Testament, you see it as sort of this synonym for patience and endurance and acceptance, and sort of struggling with and allowing something to sort of play out and doing it with love. And so to give some clarity to that thought, to bear with one another in love is not, check this out, is to specifically not push forward your agenda, push forward your sort of thoughts and your opinions, but to endure a situation or be patient in a situation with love as your guiding force for that. And so this shows up again in Colossians 3. This is Colossians 3. Again, Paul writing to the church at Colossae. Verse 12, I'm going to read this, is 12 and 13. "Put on then is God's chosen one." So check this. If I'm God's chosen people, I am a Christian, exemplifying Christ, driving people to the gospel, driving people to be a united people, right? Holy and beloved, these are things that I should exemplify. Compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. And then check this out. Bearing with one another. That's all it says. Bearing with one another. Enduring. That is a affirmation by Paul that everybody you run into, even inside the Christian community, I would even go so far as to say, especially inside the Christian community, is not going to agree all the time. Right? There are going to be things that divide us. I mean, look, forget all the craziness in our world. Just look at all the divisiveness, the differing opinions inside even the evangelical community. And some of those things need to be fought over. Some of those things need to be struggled with, right? But those things, those items, what we differ in opinion on, what we struggle with in practice, should not be a dividing force. Why? Because we should, according to Ephesians 2, according to Colossians 3, bear with one another, endure with one another, be patient with one another. Look at each other the same way, and I wrote this down, look at each other the same way that Christ looks at us. I do things all the time that deter from Christ, differ from what Christ would want me to do, does not show a good example of Christ. And yet, what is Christ's response? It is to bear with me in love, to endure with me, to hold and be faithful to me, even when I don't deserve it, especially when I don't deserve it. Paul's writing to us in Ephesians 2 right? In Colossians 3, in a culture that doesn't want, this is not something we want to embrace. Look at all the, I'm going to say this, but look at all the riots, look at all of the protests, and I'm not saying those things are bad. What I am saying is when they drive us apart, they are divisive and anti-gospel. They're anti what we're driving towards, right? Our goal as a Christian is unity, not division. And so if it means, and I say this with all love, if it means that I need to endure, I need to be patient with a issue or with a topic that I may not completely agree with, if me doing that means, and it drives people together rather than divides them, according to Paul in Ephesians, Paul in Colossians, Jesus in the Gospels, man, we should be peacemakers, right? We should be walking in humility. We should be bearing with one another, enduring with one another. The real weight of that word bearing is to put my arm around somebody that I may not agree with and to walk in love with them, enduring and bearing with them, even when I don't agree with them. Because that is the picture of what Christ has done to us. He has saved us, picked us up from rebellion and from a mire and the mess that we were in, and put his arm around us and bears with us daily, despite the things we do to try and separate ourselves from him. He bears with us. He endures with us. He is patient with us in love. It is his love that drives those things, right? Bear with one another in love. How can I not react to the issues of this world by enduring, bearing with one another? And I want to end with this thought. There is 1,000 things out there right now that we can disagree with or agree with. Just get on a social media platform. Turn on the news, right? There's probably 1,000 rallies or a riot or whatever that you can go join. And I'm not saying you shouldn't. What I am saying is, can you say you're doing those things in an effort to bear with one another in love? Right? There's a place and a spot for you to voice your opinions. There's even commendation for that in Scripture, to stand up for what is good and what is right? And to stand up for the gospel, right? But it must be done according to Ephesians 2, according to Colossians 3, according to much of Scripture. It must be done in an attempt to bear with one another, endure with one another, be patient with one another in love, right? It is not like your opinions cannot be fleshed out. Your thoughts cannot be fleshed out. Your differences cannot be fleshed out in division and dividedness that pushes people away from each other and pushes people away from Christ. It must be worked out in an effort to bear with one another, endure with one another, sit down with each other, talk to each other, be reasonable with each other, bear with one another in love so that it drives people together. Right? That's what drives unity, is when I'm willing to compromise a little bit on certain issues, when I'm willing to at least come to the table with a reasonable mind, enduring and bearing with one another. Why? Because ultimately, my opinions, my desires, what I want to see fleshed out, what I want to see happen in the political realm, what I want to see happen in the religious evangelical realm, all of those things always will fall second to God's glory through the exaltation of Christ. Right, for the good of the world. Always those things fall second. And so if I am willing to take my opinions, my desires, my thoughts, my differences, and place them above the glory of God and above the exaltation of the gospel, right, I've made an idol of those opinions, an idol of those beliefs, right? If they don't fall second and in my opinion, are driven from the gospel, from the glory of God, right, they're divisive. Right? Make sure that the things we stand for, right, when we're willing to put our feet down on something, is something that's driving people towards the gospel, and it's driven from a real sentiment that we're going to bear and endure with one another in love. I may have all the best intentions in the world, right? I may be willing to go call somebody out or go do a march, whatever it is, right? Or even say something on Facebook. But if it ever does the opposite of this, right? Opposite of it doesn't drive people to each other, it drives people away. I would ask you to question whether you've made an idol of whatever that issue is, and whether or not you're willing to sacrifice some of your own desires for the good of the gospel, because unity is far more exemplifying of the gospel than you getting your opinions out on Facebook or out on Instagram or out on the news. Make sure that we're driving. As Christians, it's our responsibility to, if we're going to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which we've been called, it's our responsibility and our honor and our privilege to bear with one another in love, to endure with one another in love, be patient with one another in love, because that's what drives people together and ultimately drives people to the gospel. Love you guys. We'll finish this series up next week.